everyone to this year's convening, Truth and Transformation 2021, Reflection on a Year of Promises. We have nearly 2,000 people registered with 3 amazing panels, a midday conversation not to be missed, and 2 musical performances. We have received over 150 questions so far and have read every one. A few quick and important housekeeping items. We're using a new web platform this year, so I ask for your patience with any technical glitches. If you do need technical help, please send a chat to the organizers through the Whova chat function under the Community tab, or you can email info@ash.harvard.edu. Please put your comments in the chat box to the right, and we will be reading those throughout the day. Questions for the panelists can be put in the Q&A tab, and we will be culling those to provide to the moderators during the Q&A of each panel. To read more about our panelists, please check out their full bios in the app. At the end of each panel, a short, and I do mean short, survey will pop up. We appreciate your time to provide feedback to us to make next year's convening even better. We take that feedback very seriously. Please tweet and post to social media, hashtag Truth and Transformation, @IRA_HKS. All keynotes and panels will be recorded, closed captioned, and sent to registrants at a later date, with the exception of the midday conversation, which will not be recorded, and we ask that you do not record it. Closed captioning will have a slight delay today, as it is a real live human being. Over lunch, we will have 2 musical performances, The Reminders and the Brown Rice Family Band. Last year, the musical performance was truly one of the highlights of the conference. Please note, today's convening was free and open to the public. We hope to keep it that way. If you can and you would like to, please donate to the IRA project. You could do so by following the Donate Now button in the chat. Make sure to click the IRA project in the drop-down menu to direct the funds to our work. We are honored today to open our convening with Elizabeth Solomon, an enrolled member of the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapaug. Ms. Solomon currently works as the Director of Administration in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and she has 3 decades of public health experience working in both university and community-based settings. We are privileged to have her here today to give our land acknowledgement. Elizabeth, over to you.
Good morning. When Indigenous communities in the United States gather together, they traditionally acknowledge and honor the ancestral holders of the land they are meeting on. Many non-Native communities have begun to incorporate this practice in public events, both to honor the Native peoples who belong to the land and to recognize that the use of the lands by others has come as a result of the displacement of the land's original owners. I'm speaking to you from Native space and from the greater Boston area, which is located on the traditional territory of the Massachusetts tribe and where my people's connection to the land spans millennia. If you visit or live on our lands, I ask you to treat them as something precious. Many of you are joining us from other parts of the country and world, but know that wherever you are in the Americas and in many other parts of the world, you are on Indigenous land, and there are people whose connection to that land endures, regardless of who currently occupies it. Be mindful of how you interact with the lands and its peoples. We remember those who came before us, and we prepare for those who will come after us. Here is where we laughed, cried, loved, made music, practiced our beliefs, shared both food and knowledge, and made both useful and sacred things. Here is where we raised our children and buried and honored our dead. Here is where English colonists began their conquest of the continent. Here is where our relationships with the colonists were built, destroyed, and built again. Some of these relationships were friendly and beneficial. Others were fraught with conflict, sadness, and loss. Here is where those who came to live among us saw land, resources, and sometimes people as commodities to be bought and sold. Here is where we maintained, sometimes in secret, our commitment to our own values and beliefs about the nature of the world, the land, resources, and people. Here is where we made alliances, intermarried, and made ongoing communities with people from other Native groups and with those from other cultures. Here is where we continue to live, holding the land and traditions of our ancestors. And here is where our children's children will continue after us. Here is where we laugh, cry, love, make music, practice our beliefs, share food and knowledge, and make both useful and sacred things. Here is where we raise our children and bury and honor our dead. Here is where thousands of years of Indigenous histories across the Americas underlie the better known narratives of the dominant society. These Indigenous histories flow through our culture like currents in the water or wind in the grasses, easy to overlook, but profoundly consequential. I mentioned earlier the protocol of acknowledging Native lands and peoples and asked you to honor the land we share as precious. But I also challenge non-Native peoples and institutions to go beyond verbal land acknowledgements and to consider what it might really mean to honor Native space. Honoring Native space means realizing that the colonization that affected this continent and much of the world is not something that happened and was completed centuries ago. The systems that led to the colonization of this land and its people are still in place, and the colonization of this place and others continues. We continue to colonize when we build so many structures that we cannot see or touch the actual earth, that other living things are displaced, and that rainwater must be diverted far away from where it lands. We continue to colonize when we gentrify neighborhoods, not to improve the lives of those who already live there, but rather to intentionally uproot their homes, their ways of life, and their institution so that we may be more comfortable. We continue to colonize when we ignore or discount the knowledge, beliefs, and perspectives of those who do not have the background, education, vocabulary, or resources that we enjoy. We continue to colonize anytime we hoard resources or set up systems designed to benefit the few. So honoring Native space means recognizing and resisting our many individual acts of colonization, and it means actively working to dismantle its systems. Honoring Native space also means considering every action with its broad consequences in mind. It means understanding that everything we do necessarily resonates through the larger environment. It acknowledges that even the breaths we take have an effect well beyond our individual bodies. It means living as if other lives are dependent upon our individual actions, because they are. And crucially, it means realizing that all individuals, regardless of where we are from or where we belong, are in reality only short-term visitors. And because we have the ability to make profound and lasting changes in and to our world, we also hold the responsibility to consider that world in everything we do. May all that we do in Native spaces both honor the land and prepare the way for all of those to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your very powerful and moving land acknowledgement and for your truth telling. Now I want to turn things over to Tony, Director of the Ash Center, for a few words of introduction. Over to you, Tony.
Thanks very much, Miriam. And thank you for giving me the opportunity just to say a few words at this opening on behalf of the Ash Center. I promise I'm going to get out of your way quickly so that we can get on to the real work of today, which of course is what you're here for. But I want to start by thanking my colleague, Khalil Gibran Mohammed, and the whole team for organizing what I know is going to be a tremendous set of discussions through the day. The program really does look quite terrific. And I also want to thank Elizabeth for those stimulating, emotional, and important words with which we've just begun today's proceedings. So we personally, and the whole crew at ASH, we couldn't be more excited to have Khalil and the team with the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project, now as a part of the ASH Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. And of course, we're very lucky to have Khalil as one of the members of our core faculty in residence at the ASH Center. As many of you will know, he's the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And of course, is also the founder and faculty director of the IRA project. His scholarship examines the broad intersections of issues related to racism, economic inequality, criminal justice, and democracy in US history. So his work and that of the IRA project as a whole, I feel, has really become a critical component of the ASH Center's mission to strengthen and to support democracy and democratic institutions, not only in this country, but also around the world. It's so patently obvious that we cannot talk about democracy and democratic institutions without talking about and considering racism. The pursuit of anti-racism and anti-racist goals is clearly part and parcel of the work to make governments and other organizations, including our own here at Harvard, the Kennedy School, and the ASH Center, more accountable, more inclusive, and responsive to all of our partners, citizens, and those with whom we wish to engage. So I really do look forward to the discussions reflecting on a year of promises and our continued work together, transforming institutions, norms, and values to promote an anti-racist and democratic future. I also hope that by that we'll be able to hold organizations to keep the promises that we've made over this year or year and a half, and that we don't lose momentum. We don't think that these problems have been fixed, and we continue to seek and question how can we improve our organization and how do we chart what else can be done as we move forward. So I want to welcome you all once again on behalf of the ASH Center, and I know this is just going to be an extraordinarily stimulating and engaging day.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Tony. I really appreciate that very warm introduction. My name is Khalil Gibran Muhammad, and I'm extremely pleased to have this chance to welcome you to the third annual Truth and Transformation Conference of the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project, IRA. If we were all together, we'd hold a raffle for who can put all those words together without stuttering. It's a mouthful, but the work that we have before us, I think, is as indicative of the challenge of saying all those things flawlessly. I have so many wonderful people to thank for bringing us here today, and that begins with you, those who have registered for this conference. We are grateful for the numbers. We are looking at something like 2,000 or just shy of 2,000 who've registered. And of course, we expect to see as many of you show up today as possible and to stay with us. We have an incredible lineup of panelists, including those folks who will just get us underway in a moment shortly. But I have to also thank so many people who have helped make today possible. And that is to start with Tony Sach, the director of the ASH Center for Democratic Governance, who we've just heard from. Also, my colleague, Seti Warren, who is the executive director of the Institute of Politics that helped to co-sponsor last night's conversation with Heather McGee and Ibram Kendi. I also want to thank the team that I work closely with, led by our program director, Miriam Ashkenazi, who you've already met, as well as senior research fellow, Erica Licht, who will be on shortly, and Angel Rodriguez. Our research assistant, Rutna Gill, does so much to help a lot of what we do on the day-to-day happen, and our collaborator, Carrie Radcliffe. We also have a number of graduate students who help to stand up our research action portal that helps us to aggregate the published scholarship and white papers so that we learn from what other people in the field are doing, including some of the folks who will be part of the panels today. I also want to thank folks at the Ash Center, Tim Burke, Melissa Dianello, Julian Crescimano, Sarah Gushta, Daniel Harsha, and finally at the IOP, Nanda Chitra. So to set some opening reflections on what is the occasion for our gathering today, we believe that the interest reflected in the 2,000 people, nearly double last year's number of registrants, represents the urgency of a serious matter that has been unaddressed, or shall we say underaddressed, for 400 years. And I don't say that casually. Having taught history for 25 years now, I'm more aware than ever how much cycles of history repeat, or at least rhyme. And in this country, they do so about every 50 years. Structural oppression was never an accident to begin with. It wasn't a bump on the road to universal liberty and scientific enlightenment. Colonization, as my colleague Elizabeth Solomon has already described, and various configurations of coerced labor were not system failures, but were instead the engines of innovation and eventually the foundation of global capitalism. So how do we break the cycle? How do we acquire and sharpen the tools we need to dismantle systems functioning as they were intended? One of the most difficult aspects of dismantling structural racism is having the evidence of proven methods of success. People ask me all the time, what's the best intervention? Who are the leading researchers? What data are you using? And the truth is, we don't have great answers to these questions because we haven't been solving for those problems. In spite of 50 years of so-called post-civil rights advancement, most people in higher education and nonprofits and philanthropy and government, and most certainly in the private sector, were not solving for systemic racism and therefore not producing the tools or the knowledge or the practical experience. They were solving for individual skill acquisition and access. Most leaders and managers of institutions across every sector of society believed that civil rights legislation and anti-discrimination policy would on their own level the playing field. But what foolishness. It was obvious to the civil rights leaders of the 1950s and 1960s and the Black Power leaders of the mid-60s and 70s that this was never going to cut it. Dr. King himself, a paragon of what so many Americans came to believe was a kind of colorblind universalism, as Dr. Kendi has recently written in an Atlantic Monthly piece, was distorted beyond recognition. Kendi calls it a second assassination of Dr. King because he so clearly understood himself the failures and limits of the civil rights movement to solve a problem of systemic nature, to solve a problem of white people's commitment to the status quo. But it should have been obvious to everyone that not only was racism a compounding injury, that is, what your grandparents and parents didn't have, you were less likely to have less of, as well as relative to your white counterparts. In other words, just like assets get passed one generation to the next, so too do liabilities. Because part of the liability is that your identity marked you as a risk. As a risky borrower, a risky classmate, a risky neighbor, a risky leader who might change the way a company does its business. But higher risk, as every business person knows, also means potentially higher profits. So with that came predatory contract home sales, subprime loans, usurious credit card schemes, payday loans, exorbitant rents for substandard housing, overpriced groceries and food deserts. The list goes on. All the while driving down real wages for low-wage essential workers. The very people, my people, since the 1960s, who had once been excluded from equal participation and were now told racism doesn't exist, have since then been subjected to what my friend and colleague Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who recently won the MacArthur Genius along with Kendi Award, calls predatory inclusion. It goes something like this. Welcome to the American dream. where access means you pay more for less. And technology is not likely to save us either. Old ideas have constantly been repackaged into new technologies. And today we haven't quite gotten to the other side of this problem. What Dr. Joy Bulawimi calls the coded gaze, where racial identity marks difference or invisibility with greater speed and efficiency and even less accountability. Who is the discriminator when an algorithm says you're not human or steers you to buy a home in a red-lined neighborhood? Structural racism does not require individual bigots or racists. The racism is baked into the algorithm, the credit report, the police department, the neighborhood school, the patient profile, the curriculum. All you have to do is follow the rules. And structural racism doesn't matter if you are not white. You can be black or brown, Asian or indigenous. You can be native or immigrant. You can be cis or trans. You can be gay or straight or LGBTQ+. Everyone can participate, even run these systems. And for a few lucky ones, you can become rich in the process or at a minimum become a model minority. What brings us here today is to continue the work of identifying how these systems work, how they are sustained, how they mutate and shapeshift. But also we are here to learn how people are developing tools and workarounds, writing new policies, practices, and procedures to change things, to rewire the circuits, to transform institutions. 2 years ago, we hosted our first TNT conference where we focused on starting change in our own house. My team and I believe that as we began this work, we were in no position to produce research and practical knowledge about achieving racial equity and accountability in the workplace that might inspire others if our own house wasn't in order here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I can report that things have changed for the better. Because at the end of the day, this is the work. Where we find ourselves spending our most productive lives and time of day, each and every day, year after year, is the work. It's important what happens in a legislative house, whether it's Congress or your state house, what matters in a gubernatorial setting or at the White House. All of these things most certainly matter. But if we ignore the responsibility that we have as individuals in the places where we lean into most of our work, then we are forsaking our obligation and the potential for making lasting change. Our theory of change began ultimately with historical reckoning, that coming to terms with where you are as an individual and your organization sits in relation to the history of racialized power is the first step towards transformation. Just as individuals are constantly told from a young age through adulthood, and are then constantly reminded by economic, civil, and political leaders to take personal responsibility for the choices you make, we believe it's time for institutions and those who run them to take personal responsibility for this work. So today we're going to reflect on a year of promises in the wake of the largest protests for racial justice in American history. And with that, I am so excited to learn and to be in community with so many people who have worked really hard over the past year to help advance this work. And at this time, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Senior Research Fellow Erica Licht, to open up or to introduce our first panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalil, and so happy to see all of you, all 2,000 of you who registered for our convening this morning. We are incredibly excited to be here, to have you all here. We've been planning all year for your arrival. And as it's our third convening, I really look forward to this opportunity every year to gather with some of the most critical voices and minds, organizers, scholars, writers, organizational leaders, reporters, students, educators. We have everyone here to have this conversation. And it's really in line with everything Dr. Muhammad has just shared with us about the deep need for reckoning, the deep need for truth-telling. And as James Baldwin also reminds us, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I'm thrilled to kick off our first panel in a moment. And just before I do, I want to extend a big thank you to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for sponsoring today's convening. And again, a big thank you to the Ash Center team that's done a remarkable job with all of the behind the scenes to make everything seamless today. So this first panel, Money Left on the Table, the economic argument for diversity, will really dig in and start tackling the questions. We are joined by moderator Levi Sumagaysay, reporter at MarketWatch, and panelists Jarik, Conrad, executive director at Equity at Work. Also joined by Dana Peterson, chief economist at the Conference Board, Lisa Cook, professor of economics at Michigan State University, and Michael McAfee, president and CEO at PolicyLink. We encourage you all to read more about their bios through the Whova platform and our conference pages. And without further ado, and a few minutes early, which is a great start, I will hand the mic over to Levi. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here moderating this very distinguished panel. I wanted to go ahead and get right into it. Last fall, Citi published a study that showed $16 trillion has been erased from the US GDP in the past 2 decades because of discrimination. That's business revenue and jobs. Talk about money being left on the table. The study also found that if the racial divide were addressed today, we could add $5 trillion to the economy over the next 5 years. Lisa, I was wondering, in light of that, can you talk about the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats?
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for the invitation to join these distinguished panelists and to address this urgent question. I work on the economics of innovation, work on patents. And what I see is if we were to invest in innovation and separately infrastructure, and the two are connected, but if we invested in those two, those could lift all boats. Okay, so how would innovation lift all boats? If we included as many people as possible, if we address the racial and gender disparities in the innovation process from beginning to end, from education and training to practice as inventors to commercialization, we would increase the productive capacity of the United States. And we would also lift the boats of everyone by raising living standards. Now, I'm not naive. Of course, policymakers have to pay attention to distribution and to equity. But if you're increasing the productive capacity of the United States, you're ostensibly doing it for everybody else. And what do I mean by paying attention to distribution? I mean, for example, making sure that everyone can participate, whether we're talking about women or African Americans. Workplace climate is a big issue. This is why Google workers organized recently. And this is also why a Tesla worker won a $137 million settlement because of these workplace issues. They are not trivial. So I would say that we really have to address these racial and gender disparities. And with respect to infrastructure, you have heard the case. I mean, I've been talking about infrastructure probably for 20 or 30 years as an economist, and the Biden administration has made that argument. This is one of the most equitable ways to increase long-run growth and to lift all boats. Fixing bridges and roads so that people can get to work, making broadband fairly universal so that everybody can work from home or work from school, do everything that they need to do wherever they are. So I think there are many investments, and childcare, I think, is critical for both of those types of investment, whether we're talking about innovation so that more women can participate in the innovation process, or we're talking about as a fundamental part of an infrastructure package, I think childcare has to be taken very seriously. It's not going to work, and there aren't going to be equitable jobs if we don't do that.
Michael, can you talk a little bit more about other economic arguments for diversity and racial equity?
I think Lisa laid them out quite effectively. One thing that I think it's important to think about when you listen to what Lisa shared with us is, why is my humanity predicated on making the case in the first place? Sometimes I think we have to trouble the question and the lines of inquiry that we go down. Because the mere fact that I got to do that means we've centered whiteness over my humanity. And sometimes you can get so fancy that you think if you can just make the case that that's actually going to trump the anti-Black racism that is running through the DNA of this nation. It won't. The case has been made. Lisa just made it. I mean, people have been making it for years. And the reason why you can use a number like trillions of dollars being added to our GDP and that it would lift all boats and it still doesn't connect with people, it's because my humanity isn't fundamentally placed on the same level as whiteness is. And we really should stop and think about that, because as we think about this moment to be inclusive, all leaders have to really stop and ask themselves, what is it about the nature of our individual being that makes it so hard for us to resist? Well, it makes it just so hard to see people's humanity. Because if you can't answer that question, quite frankly, economic arguments mean nothing to you. They mean nothing to you. And the National Equity Atlas as an additional resource to what Lisa said is a powerful example, but it corroborates what she said. We know that we're leaving at least $2 trillion every year on the table because of the racial disparities that are out there. And we have many examples of when you design for the most vulnerable, it has cascading benefits to others. Angela Glover Blackwell at PolicyLink coined a phrase, the curb cut effect. Those little cutouts in the sidewalks that we use every day weren't designed for me, but I benefit from them. UPS and FedEx drivers benefit from them every day. There are a host of examples where when you design for those who are being left behind, it benefits us all. And in addition to what Lisa's saying, what I'm asking us to begin to think about centering in this conversation is, why should my value, a case for it, have to be made in the first place? I don't operate that way at PolicyLink. People don't have to make a case to be at PolicyLink. That's my job to see them. And if I can't see them, I shouldn't be in this role as president and CEO. And some of this, what you hear me describing, and this is the last thing I'll say, is leaders should be held account for whether they want to do the job that the nation needs them to do, that their organizations need them to do or not. And to not allow folks to participate in work avoidance by romanticizing economic impacts that they actually have no desire to actually bring about. This is the work for our generation, to usher in the innovation and prosperity that Lisa described. But we're not going to get there, and we need to be real serious about this. You can't get there when you don't recognize, by just the mere line of inquiry, you've just told me that my value is insufficient to whiteness.
Thank you for that. Along that same line, Jarik, I wanted to ask you, do moral considerations matter to why companies should be anti-racist?
I think they have to. I mean, just piggybacking on what Michael said, when you talk about, hire us because you can make more money, that reduces us to something very transactional. It kind of makes us widgets instead of human beings. And so I think there are a number of ways that we got to approach this moral question. Number one is, what we're living in is a kind of alternate reality. It was a created reality. Like, we would already be there if it wasn't for those policies and practices that Khalil spoke about before. So you're not giving us anything. What you're doing is you're kind of righting the ship the way the ship would have been, otherwise. So we have to think about the moral piece, because as both of the panelists just mentioned, the economics really won't matter. Facts don't drive behavior. Emotions drive behavior. We don't see what's in front of us. We see what we want to see. We see what we need to see, what makes us feel good, what we expect to see. And so for me, we got to really start to understand a little bit more about neuroscience and psychology, how human beings process information, how we fall into specific logic traps based on how we're wired, how tribalism still affects us. All these are more qualitative kind of things rather than you hear the economics of it. The other thing, too, is that it's dangerous because, we have all kinds of examples in life where doing the right thing is better for us in the long term. We still don't do it. Most of us know, I'm going to sneak this in because I'm 100% plant-based. Most of us know that eating red meat potentially causes some chronic health issues, but people still eat steaks and hamburgers every day because there's something that's down the road. It's not necessarily a guarantee. Some of that data is squishy for people. So some of the data that we use that we think, well, once they hear this, they're going to operate differently, just unrealistic. I mean, just historically, think about just famous examples. I'm a baseball fan. Think about Jackie Robinson and, think about the Negro Leagues and all the talent that was there, but, they didn't want him in the major leagues. When Jackie Robinson came over, he's the best player on the field, but even his teammates didn't necessarily want to play with him, even though he was going to win them games. And so we can't think about what the quantitative outcome or what the numbers might be in terms of profit. And we have to tap into people's emotion. And unfortunately, it's hard to do that unless they have a personal connection. People don't necessarily become more open about LGBTQ plus, for instance, until they have a son or daughter who comes out. You don't necessarily have somebody Black in your family. And so it's difficult to have those connections.
I hear you. I wanted to bring Dana into this whole conversation about sort of what Jarik and Michael just said. But Dana, what are the other pitfalls of making economic arguments for ESG in business?
Sure. So I'll admit I was the person who wrote that report. So let me give a little background for why I wrote it the way that I wrote it with some other colleagues, but I was the main author. I was sitting at an investment bank that I'd been working for 18 years, and our audience were institutional investors, people who, are very analytical, who think about money all day, how to make it, how to preserve it, how to grow it. And so for these folks, and also this report was different from anything I'd ever done because everything else was, to speak to economic data, right? Financial markets. And so this was very different. And I think just as important as conveying the moral aspects of a theme or a topic or an issue is speaking it in a language that people understand. And so I was trying to speak to our clients who are institutional investors who understand concepts like GDP, growth, leaving money on the table, right? And the interesting thing is that I think that report, as well as a number of other reports, done by McKinsey and others last year and even before, we wrote our report, was that the financial services business woke up and they're like, oh, gee, you know what? The wealth gap, a lot of that's our fault. We're the ones who have been denying people access to credit, denying people access to mortgages, overcharging people for having accounts. We're playing a definitive role in this. we're not responsible for all of it, but certainly, we played a role. Indeed, insurers, wow, we played a role over a century ago in redlining communities and denying entire groups of people access to housing that generates intergenerational wealth. And I think it was this collective realization that prompted them to commit $50 billion. Now, what they do with that $50 billion is super important. And what I've read is that a lot of it's loans, but that's a start. Whereas before you couldn't even get a loan. And one shocking thing that we discovered in the report was out of that accounting of 16 trillion, 13 trillion of it was due to businesses that were not able to stay open or even start up because they could not get a loan or access to financing. Along every step of the path towards financing, it was the most likely that Black entrepreneurs would say, I did not get what I asked for. And if you think about it, entrepreneurs, these are not ignorant people. These are brilliant people who are usually already successful in something else, right? I think about friends who work on Wall Street and then start up their own hedge funds and their own venture capitalism firms, and the thing is that these are people who are already successful and they go to a venture capitalist and they're denied because the venture capitalist doesn't know them. And when we look at the venture capitalist space and the angel investing space, it's very monochromatic, right? And it's because they don't trust and they don't know, right? And so that was really shocking. And when you also think about the 6 million jobs that aren't created because these Black entrepreneurs were denied access to financing along every point in the spectrum, that 6 million a year, that's incredible. Right now we have 5 million people who are not working, right? And potentially, if we gave Black entrepreneurs the ability to finance their businesses, right? Because all businesses need lines of credit and financing, that we could solve the unemployment problem right away. So, the aim of the report was really to speak to those people who have the power to do something about access to money, right? Given the fact that, yes, this is hundreds of years in the making, right? And our economy in the US was built upon slavery and indentured servitude. And that, after World War II, you had policies put in place that denied, again, entire groups of people access to the GI Bill, access to the ability to buy homes in the suburbs. Like, I just think about my grandparents who lived in the Fort Greene projects in Brooklyn. Now Fort Greene is all cool, right? Everybody wants to live there. But when my mother was growing up there, it wasn't necessarily. But the interesting thing is that when they first moved there, right, my grandfather was a World War II veteran, you had all different racial groups living there. But then little by little, all the people that were left were the Black people, because they were denied access to loans to purchase homes. And so I think that, the report itself, talks a lot about action. What can individuals do? What can businesses do? Governments and nonprofits. But it also focuses on the history, which is something a lot of people just did not know. It did not realize that they were either the beneficiaries of policies and practices that were put in place long ago and are still perpetuated, as my colleagues have mentioned. So again, I think, the morality is so important, but also being able to speak to people in a language that they understand. And, on Wall Street, that language is money. So I think it served a purpose, and that it was useful in speaking to a very powerful constituent.
I wanted to turn to, so studies like the one that you wrote, Dana, and other studies that show that diversity is good business. Lisa, in my experience covering DEI issues at companies, there continue to be skeptics of such studies that show that diversity is good business and advantageous for companies. Is it important to convert the skeptics? And how do you do that if they don't believe all these studies and data points?
So I think I'll answer your question with a story. I work on patents, and a lot of the work that I have done just fell off the page, right? So I just noticed, for example, that men and women patented at different rates, that African Americans, women, and all patentees patent at different rates. And one of the things I certainly found from the very beginning is that co-ed patent teams, that mixed gender patent teams, were more productive than single sex male or single sex female teams. And because I go to Silicon Valley once a year, or at that time I was going once a year to conduct interviews related to my research, I was being asked by companies, by HR departments, to come make the case to their CEOs. And some of these are the leading tech companies that you all know, to come and make the case because they couldn't do it by themselves. They couldn't show their CEOs the data related to diversity in and of itself. And as the others on the panel have stated, make the moral case. They were making the moral case in these studies, I suppose. And they said, what they're going to listen to is that we're leaving a lot of money on the table because these patents aren't happening. If mixed gender teams are more productive, and I think I think it's not just mixed gender teams that are more productive. This is just, this is consistent with the other studies, those studies that they were probably being asked to cast aside. But we have a lot of literature since then. This is in the mid 2000s, early 2010s, when I was doing this research. So a lot has happened since then. There's a lot more empirical evidence that suggests that those who are on diverse teams get to problem solving much faster and engage in problem solving much easier and get to answers much easier and faster. So I think that this just bolstered their case, but I think it has to be, like Dana was saying, you have to speak the language of the people to whom you are asking these changes to be made. Their CEOs, they're the ones who were asking me to come talk to their CEOs because their CEOs talked in terms of value to the firm and not being good stewards. The HR departments were making the case, not being good stewards of the resources of their firms because they weren't taking advantage of all the talent they had at their firms. So I would offer that as an example to answer your question.
Levi, may I add something to what Lisa just said? What Lisa and Dana are raising is really important. It's not an either or, whether it's an economic case or a moral case, it's all of them. What you really see us struggling with is our work is actually being held hostage to having to take 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 years to make a case. That's what's frustrating to people of color when you get into this DEI work, because we're not really centering the fundamental work of this nation, which is liberatory. I mean, think about it right now. We're still making cases for DEI in so many of instances, and our counterparts are designing a world to make it look like South Africa. You know, you're denying my right to vote right now. That is structurally being done. Redlining is still happening in this nation, structurally being done. We can't get to the design of an equitable and just nation because we can't get the case landed. And all the while we're making the case, harm is still being done to us. This is why people have so much energy around DEI when you bring it into your organization. Think about it. You want me to sit still while you make it illegal for me to give my mother a glass of water because you make her stand in line for 8 hours to vote. And so the frustration is that leaders like Dana and Lisa and Jarik have been making these cases for years and years and years. And yet people have the audacity to ask us about results. The results are held hostage right now because we can't get to the liberatory work that would lift that 100 million plus who are economically insecure in America into the middle class and beyond. And so that's the tension that you're hearing, is how do we get to ever get a chance to get into the real results-based work of designing a democracy and an economy that actually works for the folks that it's never worked for. And we can't actually do that when we are constantly stuck in this cycle of having to make a case. It's totally important, but we can't seem to get beyond it in critical mass enough. Now, having said that, I've also never been in a time where you do now have all three sectors who have come to racial equity in a profound way. So maybe this is our moment right now. But I simply wanted to share that because that is what we're ultimately struggling with as people of color, is when can we get to the design of the nation to make it work for everyone?
Levi, could I comment on that as well?
Absolutely.
I think part of the tension you hear too is, I think Michael and I are talking about what should be, and I think Dana and Lisa are talking about what is in many cases. So we should not have to make the business case, but the reality is they don't listen until they hear dollar signs. The other thing that I think we need to think about is not a one size fits all. And when you go into an organization, what resonates at the C-suite level is not the same argument that resonates on the shop floor. And that's part of the challenge. You can make a compelling business case that the C-suite and investors buy into, but you got to deal with that manager on the shop floor who doesn't have stock options, who is working and making, paycheck to paycheck. And it's that person that's either macroaggressions or microaggressions that demonstrate on a day-to-day basis and making life very difficult. So the business case is not going to be the only case that resonates throughout the organization. I spent 20 years in HR and I learned that I got to have, a different rationale for different groups within the organization. For some people, it's a career case. So for some people, if I have young people coming into my organization who want to be in the C-suite one day, I can make a compelling career case for them that to understand diversity, equity, and inclusion, that cluster of skills is going to be essential for your career as demographics shift. So if you plan to be a leader here long-term, you need to demonstrate that you can connect with people from different backgrounds, because those are people that you're going to be interacting with and leading more and more. So I can make a case that's a little bit different from the business case, a little bit different from the moral case. It's what's in it for you. So I think we need to develop different strategies, different mechanisms for trying to reach people where they are. You asked a question about the skeptics. Again, I think there are at least two categories of skeptics. There are skeptics who I grew up in an environment where I was just never around anybody different from me. So I just don't know. But then there are willful skeptics, people who are willfully ignorant that we keep making excuses for. If they say, I don't know, and we present them with all the facts, and then they go somewhere right after that conversation and say, I don't know, we got to stop making excuses for them.
That's actually a good segue into what I wanted to ask you next, Jarik, was, most companies now have DEI initiatives. They report on their workforce demographics, other things like that. Yet, at least at the tech companies that I've been watching pretty closely over the years, retaining a diverse workforce has been a challenge. Considering your experience in HR, et cetera, what should companies be doing on this front?
Yeah, you're right. It's a challenge, and it is increasingly a challenge during this great resignation where people have been at home and they don't have to go to work and deal with all the things they've had to deal with. There's no coincidence why people of color are, least likely to want to go back to work in the office. So I think first we got to start with our shared humanity. We're human beings. We want what everybody else wants at work. We want a sense of purpose. We want good comp and benefits. We want to be engaged. We want a career path. All the things that anybody else would want, we want. But what companies have got to realize is the added pressures, the added burdens, the added stressors that we have being in an underrepresented population. How those stresses affect our psychology, our physiology. I mean, just the deep nature of what, some people having a code switch. You got to go into this environment that is still, in some ways foreign to me, even though I've had to navigate it, with most of my life. And so we gotta understand we're not some different, unusual breed of human being. We want what all people want, but we have to deal with a whole set of challenges that others don't have to deal with that make everything we do more difficult. And so, people oftentimes talk about we have to do double or we have to do more work. Just the mental energy and the mental exhaustion that it takes to cope, in a world that you're constantly, marginalized or treated as an outsider, is a measurable challenge, for us. And it plays itself out, in health results. We are, likely to die at a younger age, likely to experience a whole host of chronic health conditions at a higher rate. All this has to do with the stressors that we experience on a day-to-day basis. So one thing that we could do is if we have more of us in place in tech companies like the one that I work at, and the more comfortable the less odd we can make it, the fewer rooms that we could be the only person in the room, all those things are going to matter long term.
Michael, I have a question for you. I've written about shareholder advocacy groups that warn that companies are woke washing in the wake of what happened with George Floyd and the subsequent protests last year. How can companies be held accountable for the statements that they made last year? I say this, besides the pledges to say we are going to commit $100 million toward this cause or this other cause. What are other ways they can be held accountable?
It's hard because they have the power. And this is one of those things that Jarik is describing when we say we have to cope in spite of. We recently did a report from Intention to Impact that showed, it was about $70 billion pledged for racial equity, depending on how you count for it. Low end, at least around $9 billion. Them being accountable for their pledges is really not the journey. It is really the journey that Dana and Lisa and Jarik are asking people to be on. Can we begin to transform our institutions? Can we see each other's humanity, et cetera? People of color did not think all those pledges were going to be realized. If it is, it's great. But in many instances, it's still charity. People of color are not asking for charity. We're asking for a redesign of the nation. And so with all due respect, the money is nice, but it's one-offs. What really is helpful is when you think about accountability, you start seeing things like NASDAQ starting to make some requirements around board leadership. You see things like that. PolicyLink is working with a group of folks like Just Capital and B-Lab to begin to actually create a North Star racial equity standard for the nation that would make it easy for folks to step into. And the frustrating thing about right now is folks have come to this work, and our job is to create the path for them to understand how to step into it authentically. And I think accountability starts there. The first line in our equity manifesto says it begins by joining. And while you hear a great deal of frustration in my voice, the real work is to join with corporate America and show them the way. That's why the reports and the analysis that my colleagues are talking about is important, and that's the journey we're on. But it does take a deep psychological toll on folks who know that our communities are still being harmed. And so, You could also use the racial equity tracker that Just Capital has just put out as another really good tool of accountability. The last thing I'll say here is this. Real accountability starts when this work has metrics that are as rigorous as metrics for other functional areas within an enterprise. And until we get to that point, it's really hard to hold firms accountable. And so I think at a macro level, setting standards that are national standards that have been co-created with industry to allow us to have a North Star of how to move into the work, that's work that's happening right now that I'm excited by. And then when you bring DEI in, having real rigorous metrics at every level of the value chain, I think is how we begin to hold each other accountable.
Lisa and Dana, wanted to direct a question to the both of you. In the panel to kick off this conference yesterday, Heather McGee of Color of Change talked about economics as it has been taught, sort of helping to justify inequality. Can either one of you or both of you want to weigh in on that thought?
I'll start if that's okay, Dana. I'm a member of the American Economic Association Executive Committee, one of a handful of African Americans in the 100+ years of the AEA, the American Economic Association. The founder of the association was a eugenicist. And we had our premier lecture named after him. We had a small group on the executive committee, working with the executive committee to change the name of the lecture to the AEA Distinguished Lecture rather than the Eli Lecture. And I thought it was a big deal. It may seem like a small gesture, but we've never done anything like it. And it has been in place for 50+ years. Now, the reason why this is important, it's not just this lecture. He taught a generation of people, including Woodrow Wilson. And there is a recent paper that shows the damage done by Woodrow Wilson's segregating the civil service. This had a huge impact on the country, huge historical impact on the country. So what I would argue is that these ideas are often embedded in economics. And if you're not aware, then they'll get perpetuated. So I remember this whole sort of anti-union bias in my training. And, well, unions do this, they only want to raise wages. I remember one of my professors saying this, and I thought, why wouldn't you want to raise their wages? And also, they're providing this public good to all workers, right? So unions aren't just negotiating for themselves, they're negotiating for all workers. Why? It seems efficient to me. So I was being taught at the same time efficiency and wage bargaining through unions, and economists at the time didn't seem to want to marry the two. But I thought, you don't want to go talk to everybody. You don't want to go negotiate with everybody. You have an organization there that will do it. So I never taught that unions were bad or they were doing bad things. So in principle, I just rejected some of the ways that economics was taught, and I reject ways that economics is taught. And certainly in our textbooks, we don't have people who look like me or look like us on this panel. So often I am making sure that on my syllabi, I have papers by economists of color, by African-American economists writing about issues that are relevant to African-Americans and everybody else. The paper that I wrote on violence and economic growth, certainly using African-American patentees between 1870 and 1940, but relevant now and in the United States and relevant in Russia now, where I was doing my dissertation and this question actually arose. or in other places in the world where rule of law can actually impede economic growth. And this is where Michael and is it Rick? Rick's work comes to the fore. This is all part of the same problem and solution. Because I can't say you can think about rule of law on this side and you can think about economic growth on this side. You can't separate the two. So you've got to do the deep work. You can't just ignore. You can't say economists are becoming woke now. No, some of us have been doing this all along. That you've been paying attention lately is absolutely commendable. But some of us have been doing it for quite some time, making sure that everybody understands the rules. And I am talking about economics. We're living in a capitalist society. That's what I am teaching. Want to make sure that people understand the rules and where there might be any margin for changing those rules and making sure that those are applied equitably.
Dana, do you want to weigh in?
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I wanted to ask you to weigh in also, please.
Sure. I think right now businesses have a golden opportunity. And that's prefaced on the Edelman Trust Barometer, where they essentially ask people all over the world, who do you trust the most? And it's not government, it's not NGOs, it's businesses. So I think businesses are at an inflection point where they can embrace all of what Milton Friedman was trying to say, decades ago. Businesses at the time just embraced, the whole focus on the shareholder, right? But they ignored his comments about investing in social goods, which you can understand what are those social goods by listening to all your multiple stakeholders, your customers, your employees, right? Your supply chain providers, right? And also regulators and the public. And so I think that right now, this is a great opportunity for businesses to start thinking about listening to those other stakeholders, because they can help inform you on what's really important, right? Because if you don't, you are going to become beholden to shareholders who are activists and also governments who are going to regulate what you do. So you can get out ahead of this or not, or you can wait to be punished by an activist shareholder or by rules that governments institute that you don't necessarily have much of a say over, right? And then you have to backtrack and lobby to try to get some outcome that's beneficial to you. So I think that's really important. One way that economics, kind of got it right in one sense, where you do need to invest in social goods and the social good of society. Because if you think about it, going back to the report, if you marginalize entire groups and prevent opportunities for entire groups and you don't listen to them, you are missing out on a lot and you are leaving tons of money on the table, right? And also, you're not benefiting. As Lisa mentioned, and also Michael mentioned, if you're not getting the most productivity, another economic term, out of your labor force, because as Jarik mentioned, they have to deal with all the macro and microaggressions on a daily basis and do 10 times the amount of work and exhaust themselves and die early because you don't appreciate their value because of the way they look, then that's a problem. And as a business, you would want to get rid of those inefficiencies. Also another economic term. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
I want to turn to some questions from the audience. There's one from Dr. Claudia Cohen. She says, the panelists pointed to the impact of speaking the language of powerful financial professionals and mentioned the need to understand psychology and speak to individuals' emotions and personal experiences. Are there collaborations between economists and psychologists that anyone on the panel is aware of? And have they been useful in creating strategies to make structural change? And please, whoever has a thought, jump in.
I can speak to that a little bit. We have created the Equity at Work Council. So this is not a plug for an organization that I lead along with my role at UKG. But that was the purpose of this organization. I was working on a dissertation years ago, and I was looking at the relationship between emotional intelligence and intercultural sensitivity. You know, I believe that somebody who had a high level of emotional intelligence probably were more open and, you know, appreciative of human differences and all that. But I had a struggle trying to find, you know, good literature for my literature review, because I would find things in pockets. You know, I would find sometimes, you know, in behavioral economics, there'd be some pockets of things. Sometimes in sociology, there'd be some things. And so I had to piece together all this stuff. So we have started this interdisciplinary body to bring the best of what each of these disciplines have to bear, along with business leaders, as well as practitioners, you know, people who are dealing with this stuff on a day-to-day basis. So this is what we have sought to put together with the Equity at Work Council. This is something that's open to, you know, to anybody, you know, our customers and non-customers alike. So I do think there's an absolute need. Just a quick story. I'd read about a concept from a guy who he had a book. It was really popular. It was, you all know that, I hate to give it away, but there's a video where people are passing balls and you have to count the people with white shirts and all that stuff. Have y'all seen this? Without nobody shaking their heads. But anyway, you have to count the people who are catching balls, and then there's a trick to the whole thing, and I won't give it away. But I called the author of the book and the person who created that, and I said, I'm working on, you know, this book, this dissertation about diversity related issues, and I have some questions for you. He's like, oh, I wouldn't be the right person. You should talk to my colleague in sociology. And I said, well, wait a minute. Didn't you describe XYZ? And then I showed him how that really speaks to diversity. And he's like, oh, you know what? You're right. So he didn't see himself because his focus was on human nature and not even thinking about these differences. So it's important to bring these various disciplines together to take a more comprehensive look at what makes us tick and how we can tick differently.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
I would say that I'm going to nerd out a little bit that John Nash, the father of game theory, unwittingly created an economic model for giving the use case for diversity. Now, how does that even make sense? Well, a lot of it is about thinking about how people come to agreements on something. And it turns out that in order to win a game, everyone needs to cooperate. Because when you don't cooperate, you get these outcomes that are suboptimal, right? And you have clear winners and losers. And in some games, everybody loses unless you cooperate, right? So that's an example of somebody taking human behavior and trying to mesh it with economics. But it's something that, you know, can be applied to the way that we think about diversity, right? If we're all not cooperating, if we're all not playing in the game, right, by the same rules, then you get these suboptimal outcomes and you wind up with inequality and, again, leaving money on the table and an unjust society.
I'm going to go to another audience question. This one is from Cheryl Onga Nana. She asks, it is clear that only diversity devoid of a radical politic becomes good business. Why is diversity that comes with a radical politic seen as a fiscal liability? Who wants to take that on?
I'll start. I think it's because you have a lot of skeptics who say that if we embrace diversity, then I lose. You know, I'm going to lose something. And so if it's radical, meaning you redistribute the pie, a lot of people are going to say, well, I don't want that because I'm going to be a loser. You know, I'm sorry for you, but I don't want to lose. But I think if we think about growing the pie, then it's very different, right? And especially in the business context, no business wants to be told that you're not growing, right? Or you're stagnant, or you're even, you know, retreating. So I think if we, so it, you know, the messaging has to be in a way that reaches people and helps people understand, but also helps them to think more broadly and not just about what I lose, but potentially what everybody gains, and I'm part of that everybody.
Anyone else? Okay. Let me try another audience question. Letitia Price asks, in a challenging financial time in higher education, what would you all say to those who say we don't have the luxury of focusing on DEI when we're trying to save jobs?
Well, what I would say is this. You know, that 100 million number that I raised is an important number for this nation. It's probably a little higher than 100 million since we did this report a few years ago. But think about it, 1 in 3 people in this nation economically insecure, 48% at the time was white. We've designed a nation that doesn't even work for most white folks now. So you refuse to focus on DEI at your own peril. The nation is becoming too toxic. And I'll give you a good example. I live in the Bay. White folks work at these tech companies, and they're now complaining that they can't live here. But they can't live here because of some of those anti-Black laws that were passed years ago. I mean, perfect example is with busing and what it did to education. If you read The Color of Law as an example, you'll see an elegant design of what it did to the California educational system. But the reality is this, we forfeited that public good years ago in the Bay. So now if you work at Facebook, Google, and Zynga, and LinkedIn, and all these companies, you can't afford the best education without paying for it, which means you can't afford your mortgage or your rent and that private school. You got to make a choice. And you're now seeing white folks resist that, push back against the fact that they're making a good living, but they can't enjoy the full riches of the Bay. Well, the reason why you can't is because we forfeited public education because you didn't want to be educated next to me. And you can see so many examples in this nation, whether it's over policing, fines and fees, et cetera, where the design of the nation is too toxic now for white folks. Now, they may not be drawing that connection yet because we've not fully brought it into relief. But that's what I want you to begin to think about. That 100 million just in Black folks, for almost half of it is white. And you're going to see this all again, and we do this at our peril. You're seeing it happen even with the stimulus dollars that are flowing. Folks are saying we just need to spend the money quickly. We don't have time to worry about DEI and figure out how it's going to land. Think about how many small businesses were lost because we did that recently. The reality is this is what I mean. You can't keep letting, like we're going to do now, trillions of dollars wash over the very communities that are supposed to receive these dollars and then say, oops, we made a mistake. And then on the other side of the fence, want to punish these communities because you spent a lot of money in an inefficient way and outcomes don't improve. See, we keep getting punished for what whiteness does to us, right? And DEI is not the problem. The problem is, as leaders who are authorized to enact a different possibility every day, we refuse to enact the possibility where all boats will be lifted. And we've got real examples right in front of us where we get another chance to get up tomorrow and try to get it right. And that is with all these stimulus dollars. And the thing that I want everyone to understand is, unless you're extremely wealthy now, you can't buy your way out of these systems. And so whether you're Black or regardless of what color you are, you're going to suffer from them too.
I would just add one thing that I started off my New York Times guest essay, my first column last year with, and that is, we can't afford to not do DEI. So I think that this dichotomy is absolutely a false one. What I have found, and what my co-author and I have calculated, is that GDP per capita would be 0.6% to 4.4% higher if more African Americans and more women were engaged in the innovation process from beginning to end, from being educated in the STEM fields to participating in IPOs. And what this extreme wealth that is created in places like where I used to live and where Michael lives in the Bay Area is this undermining of the social fabric that is extreme. So I think that the reality is actually the opposite. We can't afford to not do it. And if you're not doing it as a firm, if you're not doing it as a country, then you're an irresponsible leader in either case. You're not a good steward of the resources of the firm or of the country if you're not embracing this. So I would say it's the wrong argument, that the argument should be flipped on its head.
I have a question that I've been asked to ask. Khalil's question, actually. Is it worth considering that company leaders and boards of directors might leave money on the table because, like everyday people, they have their own biases and ideological commitments, commitments to whiteness, to libertarian notions of freedom to discriminate, and commitment to power hoarding, which is not only about maximizing wealth, but also maximizing demographic power. You know, Khalil says when he thinks of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos rocketing and wanting to colonize outer space, he reads this as a rejection of the economic case for more equality. Who wants to weigh in on that?
I can real quick, Levi, comment on that, because, you know, I think Khalil is absolutely right. And that's what I was getting to earlier when I talked about the facts don't matter. Some of these people understand this, but the trade-off is too big for them. I mean, right now they're in an exclusive club. When you're in the C-suite and you're high, you know, you're in an exclusive club. You're in a club within a club. You know, if you look at whiteness as a club, you know, as a tribe, and you're coming with, you know, membership privileges and all this kind of stuff. Now you're talking about a club within a club. And this is, you know, that's the group that wants to maintain the status quo. The group that has benefited the most from the status quo naturally will want to maintain the status quo and not see anything wrong with it, especially when you interview them and they're going to say, I got here because I worked hard. You know, I wasn't selected, you know, because I'm in any kind of club. So I really think that with all of this, you know, I reiterate that we have to go back and think about what makes people tick, what drives us. You know, survival, we have this survival instinct, and that starts everything. You know, whether we see a threat, a real threat or a perceived threat. And, you know, what are the brain processes associated with that? And that's what, you know, creates this tribalism, this need to survive, this pack mentality. And we still carry, human beings still carry this from the early days on the African savannas. And for me, you know, we got to start to understand that. And it'll tell you exactly why we're experiencing what we're experiencing today. The other thing I'll mention is, you know, Michael, I agree with you when we talk about whiteness, but I do think we have to be careful because of this club within a club. You know, they're different drivers. You know, a politician can sit on a panel in Congress and have experts like the ones on this panel, experts come and talk about a particular subject. They get an opportunity to ask any question they want. They have the most real-time relevant facts from the best experts in the world, and they understand this stuff. They get on the plane, they go back to their hometown, and so-and-so the plumber raises their hand and say, well, I believe this. And that politician knows that what that person just said is wrong. And they'll say, you're absolutely right. Continue to vote for me and I'll make sure it doesn't happen. So this is not facts. This is not about, reality. This is not about data all the time. This is about the need to maintain the status quo. And you're going to find that with the people who benefited most from it. And furthermore, when you look at over time, it's not the talented, hardworking whites that are the challenge. They were going to be successful anyway. It's the mediocre whites. They know that I might not be at my membership. If you discount my membership, I might not have what it takes otherwise to reach a certain level of success. Absolutely, they're going to try to hold on to it. That absolutely.
Does anyone else want to say anything on that question?
You see it right now and what's happening. I mean, the reality is this is what all the voting restrictions are about. You saw what happens when people of color exercise their power in Georgia. How do you go from Georgia to 300 laws popping up in state assemblies all over the country in less than 60 days? I mean, this is what's frustrating. When Lisa was talking about holding these economic conversations and the structure of this nation together, this is why we have to hold them. The folks who say don't talk about race drive me crazy, because I wouldn't talk about it if you would stop hurting me. Like right now, race-based policy is being advanced to deny people of color the right to vote. And folks are silent on it for the most part, outside of a couple of intellectual conversations and advocates on the ground pushing back. But that's real harm. But then you go further and almost make it illegal to provide even relief to people for having to stand in line to vote. Then you make it illegal to even block a freeway. You make it a felony to protest and raise your voice against this. Think about what's happening right in front of us right now. And we're talking about DEI. When there's a party out there that has made it very clear what it thinks about me, what it's going to do to me, and it's actually not trying to frame it in a way that is palatable to me. It's just doing it. And that's the tension right now between DEI and what's happening in the world. They're not in the same realms. And if we're going to lose this nation, quite frankly, struggling with DEI, while white supremacist culture has moved well beyond taking root, it is advancing, and it is advancing very hard. And the folks who we think are our allies are philosophizing about it. And this is where business has to decide. You've seen recently what happens to downtowns when you keep harming us. Go to Michigan Avenue, you go to Minneapolis, you go to these places and you see the downtown. Oakland still hasn't recovered from the damage. If you want stable markets, you better deal with this. Because I can tell you, this young generation is no longer going to take this. They have nothing to lose. And that is the ultimate risk here. We can talk about it however we want to talk about it, but you know what? If you want stable markets, you better stop hurting us. And you're not going to solve that by creating new laws to quell our voices. These young people are, as you saw it, plus now coupled with this amazing multiracial coalition. We're going to win on this issue. We're going to win on this issue. The question is, can we accelerate it before there's a lot more harm being done? And that's the choice really in front of us all right now. One side has made very clear that they're going to advance a structural agenda. And now we have to decide, if we care about all of humanity, will we tend to the structural needs, or will we continue to philosophize another 20 years to do the work that our generation is called to do now?
I just have, our time is coming to a close. I just want to ask one last question. And please, anyone feel free to answer, in places like California, there is legislation that has been enacted to try to, force companies to diversify, their boards to diversify. One of you mentioned that, that the NASDAQ is also taking action. What are some other ways that we can that companies can be nudged to do, to go ahead and actually take action on the commitments that they've made?
I'll just say that, and I've written before, that shareholders have to hold the principal accountable, have to hold the CEO accountable, and the CEO has to hold every single leader in the organization accountable. If the leader is not being a good steward of the resources of the firm, that person should step aside and allow somebody who's going to be a good steward of those resources to lead. I would add, for the California law, this is based on empirical evidence that we see from Europe. There's a lot of literature that supports this move in California. I would say it shouldn't just be gender. There should also, one should also add race and ethnicity to these kinds of boards to get diversity along other dimensions. So I think that's a good first start, but I think a lot more has to be done.
Yeah, I can add real quickly. I know we're running short on time, but I think you're absolutely right. I think that organizations, leaders have to be accountable, but I think it's got to be broader than just the confines of that organization. I think business leaders have to think more broadly about the systems and structures that have resulted in, what we live with today. It goes back to some of what Khalil said about the history, how we got to this point. I think organizational leaders have to invest some time there and own that a little bit, because, organizations that have been around a long time have benefited from the problems that we're experiencing today. So it's got to go beyond the walls or the virtual walls of the organization.
Thank you all. Thank you all for this fascinating conversation. Really appreciate your time.
And thank you, Levi, for moderating. This has been an incredibly stimulating conversation. You all have set the bar really high for today in a great way, and really digging into the truth telling and an analysis of what's at stake and where we need to go. So we on the IRA team want to thank you all so much for your array of institutional standpoints and just years of expertise. I'm pulling away, Lisa's remarks on paying attention is commendable. And there are many of you on this panel who have been doing the equity work for a very long time, and who are really trying to understand the rules, right? And where the margin for change is. And Michael's point as well, people of color are not asking for charity. And to quote you, we're asking for a redesign of the nation. The money is nice, but it's not a systemic solution. So we're going to talk a lot more about systemic solutions the rest of today. And in this theme of reckoning and redesign of the nation, we'll certainly hear from a lot of other really incredible voices. Please, everyone out there watching and listening, take a short break. It's 11:34 now, and at 11:45, we will head back to the agenda and click on View Session to get to our next panel, Preserving Seats at the Table, How White-Dominated Boards Impact Racial Equity in Organizations. And also, please make sure you're following along on Twitter. Our research team, and particularly our Retna Giller research associate, is doing an incredible job posting material and getting the conversation going there. That's at IRA_HKS. Levi, Lisa, Jarik, Dana, and Michael, thank you so much for joining us. We really